My daughter called in panic. "Mom, he's on the bus next to me, not fixing your sink." The phone shook in my hand. Hot air, a drip under the sink. I knew exactly who she meant, and why he shouldn't be there. What I did next changed everything in this town. Stay with me till the end. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, on your phone, at work, or from your couch. My name is Dorothy Holloway. I'm 72 years old, and for the last 10 of those years since my husband John passed, my world has been stitched together with the same patience I use on my quilts. My hands, gnarled from gardening and 1,000 needle pricks, know the rhythm of a quiet life here in Tifton, Georgia. My days are marked by the sun rising over the pecan trees and setting behind the steeple of the First Baptist Church. This particular afternoon, the Georgia heat was a heavy blanket, the kind that smothers every sound except for the drone of cicadas and the high hum of my old Singer sewing machine. The air in my little clapboard house was thick with the scent of peach cobbler cooling on the counter. It was a thank you gift for Brother Elijah. He was a good man, or so I believed with every fiber of my being. He'd shown up in our town a few months back, a quiet soul with a kind smile who quickly became a fixture at church services and potlucks. He had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, and he always knew the right scripture to soothe a worried heart. He was filling a silence in this house that I hadn't even realized was so loud. He'd been under my kitchen sink for the better part of an hour, wrestling with a leaky pipe I could no longer manage myself. I heard the scrape of his wrench and his soft humming, a gospel tune I recognized from Sunday service. I trusted him. In a town like Tifton, trust is the currency we live by. It's in the unlocked doors, the neighbors who pick up your mail, and the belief that a man of God is exactly what he appears to be. That belief was the foundation of my world, as solid as the red clay beneath my feet. He slid out from under the sink, wiping his hands on a rag, and gave me that gentle smile. "All fixed, Miss Dorothy," he said, his voice soft. "You know, a fine young woman like your Sarah shouldn't be traveling all by herself on those interstate buses. It's not safe these days. A man ought to be looking out for her. I'd do anything to make sure she was safe, just as if she were my own flesh and blood." At that moment, the words felt like pure, old-fashioned kindness. I didn't know they were a threat, a claim being staked on the one precious thing I had left in this world. A flicker of something, a little chill despite the suffocating heat, ran up my spine, but I pushed it away as quickly as it came. I was just being a silly old woman. He was a good man, a church man. I smiled back, my heart swelling with gratitude. "That's so thoughtful of you, Brother Elijah. Sarah can take care of herself, but it's a comfort to know good people are still in the world." I handed him a tall glass of sweet tea, the ice clinking against the sides. He was a blessing, a godsend. That's what I told myself. He took the glass, his fingers brushing mine. They were surprisingly clean, I noticed. Not the hands of a man who'd just been fighting with a rusty, dripping pipe. There was no grease under his nails, no grime on his knuckles. It was a small detail, a tiny thread out of place in the fabric of the afternoon. But my mind, eager to maintain its peace, smoothed it over. Maybe he was just a tidy man. Maybe he wore gloves I hadn't seen. I watched him drink the tea on the porch swing, his gaze fixed on the dusty road that led out of town, the same road Sarah's bus would travel. He seemed so serene, a picture of tranquility against the backdrop of my blooming hydrangeas. He finished the glass, thanked me again, and said he had another errand to run. For one of the other church elders. He promised to check back in on me tomorrow. I waved as he walked away, his shadow shrinking in the oppressive afternoon sun. The house fell silent again, but the hum of the sewing machine was gone. I had turned it off to fix the snack, and now the quiet felt different. It was heavier. I sat in my rocking chair, looking at the porcelain angel on my mantelpiece, a gift from Sarah when she was just a little girl. My daughter. She was due to arrive at the Tifton bus station any minute now, a little over an hour's journey from her teaching job in the next town over. I couldn't wait to feel her arms around me and hear her laughter fill these quiet rooms. I lived for her visits. I think that's what I'll write. The memory of that waiting is so clear. I busied myself with tidying up, putting away the quilting squares and folding the fabric remnants. The colors were bright: yellows, blues, and greens for the church's spring charity drive. Each stitch was a prayer, a small token of my faith. I thought about Elijah's words again. Like she were my own flesh and blood. It was a strange way to put it. Possessive. I shook my head, chiding myself for being uncharitable. The man had fixed my plumbing for free and spoke of protecting my daughter. I should be thankful, not suspicious. The minutes ticked by on the grandfather clock in the hall, each chime echoing in the stillness. I glanced at the clock face. 4:15 p.m. Sarah's bus was scheduled to arrive at 4. She was usually prompt, always calling the moment she stepped onto the platform. My hand hovered over the old landline phone on the wall, the beige plastic worn smooth from years of use. Maybe the bus was just running a little late. It happened all the time, especially with the summer road work on the interstate. I decided to call her cell, a simple flip phone I'd bought her for emergencies. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Sarah. Leave a message." Her voice was cheerful, bright, and a world away from the silence on my end of the line. I didn't leave a message. I didn't want her to think I was hovering. She was a grown woman, a teacher responsible for 24 children every day. She could handle a late bus. Still, a knot was beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. It was a familiar feeling, the quiet dread of a mother's intuition. It was the same feeling I'd had the night John had his heart attack, a cold certainty that something was deeply wrong. I walked to the screen door and looked out at the empty road. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem alien and threatening. The air was still, and the cicadas' buzz now sounded less like a song and more like a warning. I went back inside and tried the bus station this time. A recorded message played on a loop, telling me all agents were currently busy. The automated voice was tinny and impersonal, offering no comfort. I hung up, the knot in my stomach tightening with each passing moment. My home, my sanctuary, was starting to feel like a cage. The walls felt like they were closing in, the sweet smell of the cobbler now cloying and nauseating. I began to pace the length of the living room, my footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floors. From the window to the mantelpiece, past the photographs of Sarah, as a baby, on her first day of school, at her college graduation. A lifetime of my love, all captured in silver frames. And in every single one, she was smiling. That smile was the center of my universe. The thought that it might be gone, that something might have wiped it from her face, was unbearable. I replayed my last conversation with Elijah. The clean hands, the strange possessive words, his calm gaze on the road. It was all circumstantial, just a collection of odd details that probably meant nothing. My mind was playing tricks on me, I insisted. I was a lonely old woman whose imagination was running away with her. But the feeling of dread wouldn't subside. It was a cold, heavy presence in the room with me. That's when I think I knew, even before the phone rang. I tried Sarah's cell one more time, straight to voicemail again. This time, I noticed something I'd missed before. My old cell phone, the one I kept in my purse, was sitting on the kitchen counter. I rarely used it, but I'd taken it out earlier to check the time. There was a notification on the screen. One missed call, from an unknown number, from almost an hour ago. I hadn't heard it ring over the sound of the sewing machine and Elijah's work. My fingers trembled as I tried to call the number back. It rang once, twice, then a click. The line went dead. It wasn't a disconnected number. It felt like someone had answered and immediately hung up. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Why would Sarah call from an unknown number? And why would someone hang up on a return call? Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through my attempts at rationalization. The peace of the afternoon was completely gone now, replaced by a raw, jagged fear. I felt utterly helpless. I was a 72-year-old woman in a small, isolated house. The sun was setting, and my daughter was missing. Every horror story I'd ever heard on the news flooded my mind. The world, which had always seemed so safe from the confines of my porch swing, suddenly felt like a dark and predatory place. I walked back to the kitchen, my legs unsteady. I looked at the pipe under the sink. Elijah had placed the old rusted piece of metal he'd supposedly replaced on a newspaper on the floor. I nudged it with my foot. It was bone dry. There wasn't a single drop of water on it, nor on the newspaper beneath it. A pipe that had been leaking for days should have been wet. The lie was suddenly clear, tangible, and sitting right there on my kitchen floor. He had never fixed the sink. It was all a pretext, a carefully constructed stage play designed to put me at ease, to make me believe he was here, in my house, while he was somewhere else entirely. The kindness was a mask. The scripture was a tool. The trust I had given him so freely had been turned into a weapon and aimed directly at the heart of my world, my daughter, Sarah. My mind raced, trying to connect the pieces. He knew her schedule. He knew which bus she took. He knew she'd be alone. He had orchestrated this, ensuring I would be blissfully unaware, waiting with a cooling peach cobbler while he put his real plan into motion. The depth of the betrayal was dizzying. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, leaving me in a freefall of terror. What were his intentions? The question screamed in my mind, but I couldn't let myself think of the answers. I had to do something. But what? Who could I call? The police? What would I tell them? That a nice man from church had offered my daughter a ride. That I had a bad feeling. They would think I was a hysterical old woman. I had no proof, just a dry pipe and a mother's terror. It was in that moment of complete and utter despair that the old landline on the wall shrieked. The sound was so violent it made me jump, a physical jolt. It rang again, a piercing, insistent summons. With a hand that shook so badly I could barely grip the receiver, I lifted it to my ear, praying to hear Sarah's voice, annoyed and safe, telling me the bus had broken down. I whispered, "Hello?" praying for a normal explanation. For a moment, there was only static, the sound of air rushing past. It sounded like an open window on a moving vehicle. Then, a voice, so small and fragile I almost didn't recognize it. It was a terrified whisper, stripped of all its usual life and warmth. It was my daughter. "Mom?" she breathed. The word choked with a fear I had never heard before in her entire life. And then came the words that stopped my heart, the words that confirmed every dark fear and plunged me into a nightmare from which there was no waking up. "Mom? He's in the seat next to me, not at your house." The silence on the other end of the line was a roar. It was the sound of a bus engine, of wind whipping past an open window, of my daughter being carried away from me. The plastic receiver, slick with the sweat from my palm, fell from my hand. It didn't clatter onto the floor, but swung gently on its coiled cord, a pendulum marking the seconds of a life that had just been torn in two. My breath caught in my chest, a painful, shallow thing. The scent of peaches and cinnamon, once a comfort, now felt like poison in the air, a sweet lie covering a rotten truth. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something solid, something real in a world that had suddenly become a nightmare. The familiar floral pattern on the wallpaper seemed to warp and twist. The steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall was no longer a gentle rhythm, but a hammer pounding away at the time I didn't have. My own home, the sanctuary I had built over 40 years, felt like a stranger's house. He had been in here. He had walked on these floors, drunk from my glasses, and planned this monstrous act from the very heart of my life. I stumbled toward the kitchen sink, my hand outstretched as if to touch the scene of the first crime, the lie that started it all. The dry, rust-colored pipe still sat on the newspaper, a monument to my own foolishness. He had never fixed the sink. He was never here, while I was humming along with my sewing machine. Believing in the goodness of a man of God, he was on a bus, closing in on my Sarah. The betrayal was a physical sensation, a cold blade twisting deep in my gut, making it hard to stand. My mind, a frantic mess of fear and confusion, started to replay every moment spent with him, every kind word, every scripture quoted. every gentle smile. It was all a performance. He had studied me, learned my routines, my weaknesses. He knew about Sarah's schedule, her job, the bus she took every week. He had gathered the pieces of my life like a collector and was now using them to build a cage around my daughter. The thought of his clean hands, his calm voice, made my skin crawl with a violation so profound it left me breathless. What does he want? The question was a raw whisper in the empty house. I sank into a kitchen chair, the wood groaning under my weight. The possibilities, each one darker than the last, flooded my mind. Was it money? Sarah had so little. Was it something else? Something unspeakable? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the images that clawed at the edges of my sanity. The face of my daughter, her eyes wide with the same terror I'd heard in her voice, was burned into the back of my eyelids. For a long moment, I was completely paralyzed. What could I do? I was a 72-year-old woman. My hands trembled just trying to thread a needle. My car, an old Buick John had babied for years, hadn't been on the interstate in a decade. Call the police? The sheriff? What would I say? A man I thought was my friend is on a bus with my daughter. They'd ask for proof. They'd call me a hysterical old woman. They'd tell me to wait, to see if she turned up. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that waiting was not an option. The feeling of utter helplessness was a shroud, heavy and suffocating. I was alone. The neighbors were at work. The church was empty on a weekday afternoon. The world outside my windows continued on, oblivious. The sun was still shining. The cicadas were still buzzing their relentless song. It felt like a personal cruelty, that the universe could remain so placid while mine was being ripped apart at the seams. My faith, the bedrock of my existence, felt like a distant, hollow echo. Where was God in this moment of pure, unadulterated evil? I looked up, and my gaze fell on the mantelpiece. Amidst the framed photos of Sarah, there stood the porcelain angel she'd given me for Christmas when she was 8. Its hands were clasped in prayer, its painted face serene. For years, it had been a symbol of divine protection. But now, looking at its placid expression, a different feeling rose in me. Not comfort, but a hot, searing anger. No angel was coming to save my daughter. No prayer from a porcelain statue was going to stop that bus. That anger was a spark in the cold darkness of my despair. It burned away the helplessness, the trembling, the fear. It was a righteous fury, the kind only a mother can know. It was the fire of a she-bear whose cub is threatened. He had used my faith against me, used my kindness as a tool to get to my child. He had counted on me being a frail, trusting old woman who would sit and pray while he carried out his plan. He had miscalculated. He had forgotten what a lifetime of love and loss can forge in a woman's soul. My husband, John, had always told me, "Dorothy, your heart is soft, but your spine is pure Georgia steel." I hadn't felt that steel in years. Not since I buried him. But now, I could feel it snapping into place, rigid and unbending. The shaking in my hands stopped. My breathing, ragged and panicked just moments before, became slow and steady. The world, which had been spinning out of control, suddenly came into sharp, crystal-clear focus. There was only one thing that mattered: getting to Sarah. I stood up from the kitchen chair, my movements no longer frail but deliberate. I walked to the wall by the back door where a set of keys hung on. A small brass hook. They were John's keys. The keys to his old Buick LeSabre, a heavy, powerful machine of American steel. I hadn't driven it much since he passed, preferring my smaller, more practical sedan for trips to the market. But the Buick had power. It had speed. It was a beast built for the long, straight stretches of the interstate. My fingers closed around the cold metal of the keys. The weight of them in my hand was solid, real. It was a connection to John, to his strength, to his unwavering belief that a person had to fight for what they loved. I could almost hear his voice in my ear, calm and steady as always. "Go on, Dottie. You know what to do." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. a transfer of strength from his memory into my very being. I didn't know the bus number, I didn't know its exact route, but I knew its destination, and I knew the highways that led there. Tifton was small, and there was only one main artery heading north, Interstate 75. If I could get on that road, if I could drive fast enough, maybe, just maybe, I could catch them. It was a wild, desperate plan, born of pure instinct, but it was the only plan I had. It was better than sitting here, waiting for a phone call that might never come. I grabbed my purse from the counter, my movements swift and economical. Inside was my old flip phone, a few dollars in cash, and my driver's license. I didn't stop to lock the door. I didn't glance back at the cooling peach cobbler, a relic of a life that no longer existed. The woman who had baked that cobbler, the trusting, gentle Dorothy Holloway, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone I hadn't met in a very long time. As I stepped out onto the porch, the oppressive Georgia heat hit me like a physical blow. The air was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe, but I welcomed it. The world was no longer a beautiful, serene painting. It was a battlefield, and the heat and the screaming cicadas were its soundtrack. I saw everything with a new, raw clarity. The cracks in the sidewalk, the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, the long, dark shadow of my own house stretching across the lawn. I walked to the garage, the crunch of gravel under my sensible shoes the only sound besides my own heartbeat, which was now a steady, powerful drum. I pulled open the heavy wooden door, and there it was, the Buick. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, a sleeping giant. It smelled of old leather and johns, faint, lingering scent of motor oil and wintergreen. It was a time capsule, and I was about to break it wide open. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn vinyl cool against my skin. The dashboard was simple, a landscape of chrome and analog dials, a world away from the digital screens of modern cars. It felt familiar, like an extension of my own memory. I put the key in the ignition. For a terrifying second, I wondered if it would even start. It had been weeks since I'd turned the engine over. I held my breath and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble that shook the entire garage. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power. It was the sound of John's stubborn refusal to give up on anything he loved. It was the sound of my own resolve, now given a voice of 8 cylinders. The garage filled with the smell of gasoline, a scent of action, of movement, of pursuit. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My hands, which had spent the morning gently guiding fabric under a needle, were now preparing to guide 2 tons of steel down a highway at speeds I hadn't dared to drive in 20 years. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was fuel. My love for Sarah was the spark, and my anger was the gasoline. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The face that stared back was not the one I knew. The soft lines around my eyes were etched with a fierce, cold light. My mouth was set in a grim, determined line. I saw the reflection of the porcelain angel on the mantelpiece through the living room window, its placid prayer a mockery of the storm that was raging inside me. Prayer had its place, but this was a time for action. I backed the Buick out of the garage, the tires spitting gravel. I didn't bother to close the garage door. I didn't look back at my little white house, my quiet life, my garden. All of that was behind me now. There was only the road ahead, a ribbon of asphalt stretching north into the fading afternoon light. My entire world had been reduced to a single, desperate mission. As I turned onto the main road, pressing my foot down on the accelerator, the big car surged forward with a power that surprised me. The needle on the speedometer climbed steadily. I was no longer just Dorothy Holloway, the quilt maker from Tifton. I was a mother, and I was going to get my daughter back. I was answering the only prayer that mattered now, the one that required gasoline, steel, and every last ounce of a mother's fury. The town of Tifton, with its church steeples and familiar storefronts, blurred past my windows. I was leaving the safety of my known world, and driving headlong into a confrontation with an evil I was only just beginning to comprehend. The sun was getting lower, casting long, menacing shadows across the road. I knew I was racing against time, against the setting sun, against the distance that was growing between me and Sarah. With every passing minute, the on-ramp to I-75 appeared before me, a gateway to the unknown. I merged into the flow of traffic, the roar of the Buick's engine joining the chorus of trucks and cars hurtling down the highway. My hands were steady on the wheel. My eyes were fixed on the horizon. I was a 72-year-old woman in a 20-year-old car, fueled by sweet tea and a holy rage, and I was coming for him. The interstate was a river of steel and noise, and I was a stone dropped into its violent current. The Buick, so mighty in my quiet garage, felt small and fragile out here, buffeted by the wake of semi-trucks that roared past like prehistoric beasts. My knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel, my arms aching from the tension. The speedometer needle trembled past 70, a speed I hadn't touched in decades. Every instinct I had honed over a lifetime, to be careful, to be cautious, to yield, had to be crushed. My first mistake came within minutes, a moment of hesitation, as I tried to change lanes. A horn blared, a sound of pure fury, and a red pickup truck swerved around me, the driver's face a mask of anger. For a second, the old Dorothy surfaced, filled with shame and apology, but she was drowned out by the roar of the engine and the singular burning image of Sarah's face. I learned quickly. There was no room for politeness on this road. There was only a brutal calculus of speed, space, and intention. I stopped thinking like a Sunday driver and started thinking like a hunter. My eyes scanned the road ahead, not just for cars, but for patterns, for openings, for the slightest advantage. The world outside my windshield became a blur of green signs for towns I'd never heard of and exits I would never take. The sun, sinking lower, cast a blinding glare across the asphalt, forcing me to squint until my eyes watered. The physical strain was immense, a deep ache settling into my shoulders and back, a testament to a body not built for this kind of war. My mind was a battleground of its own. The voice of reason, the one that had guided me my whole life, was screaming that this was insane. "Call the police, Dorothy. Pull over. You're going to get yourself killed." It was a sensible voice, a logical one, but it was useless against the primal scream in my soul that answered back, "He has my child." Logic had no place here. The rules of my old world did not apply. This was a new territory, governed by a single, terrible law. I could not fail. The thought of Elijah's calm, treacherous smile was the whip that drove me forward, silencing the fear with a fresh wave of rage. The highway stretched on, an endless ribbon of gray asphalt. I passed signs for Macon, for Perry, for places that were just names on a map, milestones marking the distance between me and Sarah. The world inside the Buick was a bubble of focused desperation. The air smelled of old vinyl, John's faint memory, and the acrid scent of my own fear sweat. I hadn't eaten, hadn't had a sip of water, but I felt no hunger or thirst. My body was running on a different kind of fuel now, a high-octane blend of love and fury that burned hotter than any gasoline. I was becoming a part of the machine, my hands an extension of the steering wheel, my foot a permanent fixture on the accelerator. Then, a new conflict arose, a practical one. I was just one car in a sea of thousands. How would I ever find a single bus? The sheer impossibility of the task threatened to overwhelm me. It was like trying to find one specific leaf in a hurricane. For a moment, my resolve wavered. The steering wheel felt slick in my hands. What if I was driving in the wrong direction entirely? What if he'd gotten off at a previous exit? The doubt was a cold poison, seeping into the heat of my anger. I had no plan, just a direction. North. It felt foolish. A child's solution to an adult's nightmare. I had to be smarter. Fury alone wouldn't save her. I needed information. My purse was on the passenger seat, my old flip phone tucked inside. Fumbling with one hand, my eyes darting between the road and the seat, I managed to grab it. My fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, struggled to open the small device. Driving at over 70 miles an hour while trying to operate a phone was the most dangerous thing I had ever done. But the thought of Sarah's whispered plea for help was more dangerous. It was the thought that could break me completely if I didn't act. I didn't know who to call. 911? They would tell me to pull over. They would ask questions I couldn't answer. No, I needed the source. The bus company. Sarah had mentioned the name before. A company with a blue and gray logo. I couldn't remember it exactly. My mind, usually a repository of small, important details, was a frantic storm. I took a deep breath, the air conditioning blasting my face, and tried to picture Sarah at the bus station. The name came to me in a flash. Crestline. It was written on her last ticket, which I'd seen on the kitchen counter. With trembling fingers, I tried to use the phone's rudimentary internet browser. The screen was tiny, the connection agonizingly slow. The car drifted slightly, and I jerked it back into the lane, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a clumsy, desperate dance between technology and horsepower. I found a number for Crestline bus services. My hands were shaking so badly I misdialed twice. On the third try, it rang. A calm, automated voice answered, asking me to press 1 for schedules, 2 for ticketing. I kept pressing 0, a frantic, repeated jab of my thumb until, finally, a human voice came on the line. Crestline, this is Brenda. How can I help you? Her voice was bored, indifferent, the voice of someone at the end of a long shift. I had to make her listen. I couldn't sound like a crazy old woman. I took another steadying breath, channeling a firmness I didn't know I possessed. My name is Dorothy Holloway. My daughter, Sarah Holloway, is on one of your buses heading north from Tifton. I believe she is in danger. I need to know the bus number and its current location. I tried to keep my voice even, but the last words came out as a raw, ragged plea. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear typing. Ma'am, for security reasons, we can't give out passenger information or real-time locations over the phone. The corporate response was a brick wall. My hope plummeted. Please, I begged, the carefully constructed calm. Shattering. A man is with her. He lied to me. He was supposed to be at my house. Please, you have to help me. I could hear the desperation in my own voice, and I hated it. I hated sounding weak. Brenda sighed, a sound of weary pity. Ma'am, your best course of action is to contact the police. I knew she was right, but I also knew the police meant delays. It meant reports and questions while that bus kept moving. Every mile a victory for him. Is there a scheduled stop? I asked, my mind grasping for any possible angle. Just tell me the next scheduled stop for the northbound route out of Tifton that left around 4 o'clock. It was a different question, a logistical one, not a personal one. Another pause. More typing. I held my breath, the roar of a passing truck filling the silence in my ear. Looks like the 4:05 p.m. departure from Tifton, Route 75 North. Next scheduled stop is the rest area just south of Cordele. ETA, approximately 5:45 p.m. My eyes flew to the clock on the dashboard. It was 5:20. Cordele. I knew that name. I had seen a sign for it not long ago. I wasn't far behind. It was a chance. A tiny, fragile sliver of a chance, but it was more than I had before. Thank you, I whispered, and hung up before she could say anything else. Cordele. The name was a prayer, a destination, a beacon in the terrifying darkness. My driving changed. It was no longer a frantic, blind chase. It was a calculated pursuit. I was no longer just running on rage. I was running on information. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but now it was surrounded by a hard, sharp sense of purpose. I knew where I was going. I pushed the Buick harder, the engine groaning in protest as the speedometer crept towards 80. I wove through the slower traffic with a newfound confidence, a series of fluid, precise movements. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, cruel sunset, marking the end of the day, the end of the light. I had to get there before darkness fell, before he had the cover of night to do whatever he had planned. The other drivers were no longer a source of intimidation. They were obstacles. The road was no longer a terrifying river. It was a path that led to Sarah. The old Dorothy, the one who would have been horrified by this reckless speed, by this blatant disregard for the rules, was a distant memory. She belonged to a different lifetime, one that had ended with a single, terrified phone call. The woman behind this wheel was someone new, forged in the crucible of this highway. A sign appeared in the growing twilight. Rest area, 2 miles. My heart leaped into my throat. 2 miles. The distance felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. What would I do when I got there? What would I say? How could I, one woman, confront a man who had proven himself to be a monster hiding in plain sight? I had no weapon, no plan of attack. I only had the keys to this car and a love for my daughter that was so fierce, it felt like it could tear the world apart. I eased my foot off the accelerator, my eyes scanning the entrance to the rest area as it came into view. The parking lot was dotted with cars and a few large trucks, their engines idling. And then I saw it. Tucked away in the back, near the edge of the woods that bordered the lot. A blue and gray bus. Crestline. The sight of it sent a jolt through me. A mixture of pure, electrifying terror and a grim, cold relief. I was here. I had made it. I pulled the Buick into a parking spot a few rows away, my hands shaking again. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer, thrumming force of the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's. Her eyes were hard, her jaw was set, and there was not a trace of the gentle, trusting woman who had baked a peach cobbler just a few hours ago. That woman would have prayed. She would have waited. She would have trusted in others to solve her problems. But I was not that woman anymore. I had driven through my fear, navigated the chaos, and crossed a line from which there was no return. I had been transformed not by faith, but by fury. And as I opened the car door, the heavy metal groaning in the quiet evening air, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer waiting for a miracle. I was going to be the answer to my own prayer. The air outside was cooler now, the oppressive heat of the day finally breaking. I could smell pine needles from the nearby woods and the faint, oily scent of diesel from the bus. Each sensory detail was sharp, hyper-real. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of stillness that comes at the very center of a storm. The internal debate was over. The stumbles and the fear had been burned away on the highway, leaving only a core of unbendable steel. I began to walk toward the bus, my sensible shoes making a soft, steady rhythm on the pavement. My purse felt heavy on my shoulder, a useless accessory from another life. I didn't know what I was going to do when I reached that bus door. I didn't have a strategy. But as I walked, I realized the transformation wasn't just about becoming strong. It was about accepting that I was all my daughter had. There would be no divine intervention, no cavalry riding to the rescue. There was only me. My shadow stretched long in front of me in the fading light, a dark, determined figure moving toward the source of my terror. I saw movement through the bus windows, passengers stretching, getting on and off. I scanned each face, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Where was she? Where was he? The questions were no longer panicked. They were tactical. I was no longer a victim of his plan. I was an active, unpredictable variable he hadn't accounted for. I reached the side of the bus, placing my hand against the cool metal. It was real. This was happening. I felt the vibration of the engine still humming deep within its frame. For a moment, I closed my eyes, and I didn't see the porcelain angel on my mantelpiece. I saw John's face, his steady eyes, and heard his voice one last time, not as a memory, but as a part of my own soul. Go on, Dottie. You know what to do. And I did. I knew exactly what to do. I was going to get my daughter. The heavy steel door of the bus opened with a pneumatic hiss, releasing a wave of stale, air-conditioned air that smelled like vinyl and disinfectant. It was a sterile, impersonal scent, a world away from the Georgia pines and damp earth of the rest stop. For a single frozen moment, I stood on the bottom step, my hand gripping the cold metal rail. The faces inside were a blur of tired, anonymous travelers, their features washed out by the dim, fluorescent lights. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my feet were steady. I was no longer being driven by panic. I was an instrument of pure, unyielding purpose. I took the final step up into the aisle. The low hum of the idling engine vibrated through the soles of my shoes. Every head turned. In that small, enclosed space, my presence was an anomaly. An old woman in a simple cotton dress, her hair wild from the highway wind, her eyes burning with a light that did not belong in this place of quiet transit. I saw them first. The back of Elijah's head, and beside him, huddled against the window, the pale, terrified face of my daughter, my Sarah. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, a universe of fear and desperate hope passed between us. Elijah turned slowly, a flicker of irritation on his face at the disturbance. When he saw me, his expression dissolved. It was a fascinating, terrible thing to watch. The kind, pious mask he wore melted away, revealing the raw shock and disbelief beneath. His jaw went slack, his eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw him not as a man of God, but as a common predator, cornered and confused. He had planned for every contingency except one: the 72-year-old woman he had left behind with a broken sink and a plate of cooling cobbler. He had fundamentally underestimated a mother's love. My voice, when it came out, didn't belong to me. It wasn't the soft Sunday school teacher voice he knew. It was low, gravelly, and held the weight of the 2 tons of steel I had just driven 80 miles an hour. "Get up," I said. It wasn't a request. The words cut through the quiet hum of the bus. I took a step forward, my gaze locked on his. "Get away from my daughter, now." I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The fury in my heart had been compressed into a diamond, and those words were its cutting edge. He tried to recover, to reassemble the mask of Brother Elijah. A weak, placating smile twitched on his lips. "Miss Dorothy," he began, his voice a pathetic imitation of his usual calm resonance. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I was just making sure Sarah got home safely, just like we talked about." The lie was so audacious, so insulting to my intelligence, that it only fueled the cold fire inside me. He was still playing the game, still believing I was the fool he had so easily deceived. Before I could answer, the bus driver, a large man with a weary face, stood up. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" "Here?" His voice was firm, but not unkind. I didn't take my eyes off Elijah. "Yes, there is," I said, my voice as steady as a rock. "This man is a liar. He told me he was in my house fixing my plumbing. He is here with my daughter against her will, under false pretenses. I want him off this bus." The words were plain, unadorned facts. There was no hysteria, no pleading. There was only the unshakable truth. A murmur went through the bus. Passengers who had been half asleep were now sitting up, their faces turning from curiosity to concern. The social fabric of the bus was reweaving itself around me, recognizing the predator in its midst. Elijah saw it too. The last vestiges of his composure crumbled. He looked trapped, his eyes darting from me to the driver, to the other passengers who were now staring at him with suspicion. His sanctuary, his anonymous hunting ground, had become a cage. In a last, desperate move of control, he reached for Sarah's arm. "She's coming with me," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. It was the fatal mistake. The sight of his hand on my daughter's skin broke the last thread of my restraint. I moved faster than I had in 30 years, closing the distance between us in 2 quick strides. I didn't hit him. I didn't scream. I simply planted myself between him and Sarah, my body a shield. I grabbed his wrist, my gnarled, arthritic fingers surprisingly strong, and peeled his hand off my child. The contact was electric. He recoiled as if burned. In my eyes, he must have seen something terrifying. Not the gentle, gullible woman he thought he knew. but the matriarch of a line stretching back through generations of strong women who had defended their own with nothing but grit and will. He saw a force of nature he could not possibly contend with. The fight went out of him completely, replaced by a sullen, defeated fear. He had been outmaneuvered and exposed. The bus driver didn't need any more convincing. He pointed a thick finger toward the door. Out. Now. Before I call the state troopers and have you dragged out. There was no argument. Elijah stood, avoiding the gaze of every single person on that bus, and shuffled down the aisle, a shrinking, pathetic figure. The pneumatic door hissed open. He stepped out into the twilight, and the door hissed shut again, sealing him out of our lives forever. The sound was the most profound and satisfying I had ever heard. I sank into the seat he had just vacated, my body suddenly remembering. It's 72 years. The adrenaline fled, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion. Sarah collapsed against me, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight, my cheek pressed against the top of her head. I could smell her shampoo, the familiar scent of my child, my beautiful, safe child. We didn't speak. There were no words for what had just passed between us. There was only the feeling of her heart beating against mine. The police were called, not by me, but by the bus driver. A state trooper met us at the next exit. I gave my statement in the back of his patrol car, the blue and red lights flashing silently in the darkness. My voice never wavered. I recounted the clean hands, the dry pipe, the possessive words, the terrified phone call. The officer listened, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to a quiet respect. He looked at me, this old woman in a dusty dress, and I think he saw the same thing Elijah had, someone not to be trifled with. When we finally got home, hours later, the house felt alien. The familiar comfort was gone, tainted by the memory of his presence. The first thing I did was walk to the kitchen counter where the peach cobbler sat, a perfect golden brown symbol of my naivete. Without a word, I picked up the pie dish, carried it to the trash bin, and scraped its contents inside. It was a funeral for the woman I had been that morning, a final, necessary burial of the part of me that trusted too easily. In the days that followed, Sarah looked at me differently. The gentle, sometimes frustrating affection she had for her old-fashioned mother was replaced by something deeper, a kind of awe. She saw me not as someone to be cared for, but as a protector, a warrior. Our roles had been reversed and then balanced in a way they never had been before. I had not just saved her. I had shown her the strength that had been lying dormant within me, the same strength I knew was now awakening in her. My tangible conquest was my daughter's safety, but the intangible one was my own rebirth. I had spent a decade since John's passing feeling like a fragile thing, a relic to be handled with care. The world felt too fast, too dangerous, and I had retreated into the safety of my home and my faith. But the highway had stripped all that away. It had taught me that my hands, which I thought were only good for quilting and gardening, could also grip a steering wheel at 80 miles an hour and peel a predator's hand from my child. The news of what happened spread through Tifton like wildfire, as it always does in a small town. The initial reactions were of shock and disbelief, especially from the church community who had been so taken with Brother Elijah. They called with words of comfort, but I could hear the admiration in their voices. The pastor himself came to my porch, his hat in his hands, and apologized for having been so deceived. "Dorothy," he said, shaking his head, "I always knew you had a gentle soul. I never realized it was forged from pure steel." I started quilting again, but the act felt different. The needle in my hand was no longer just a tool for creating beauty. It was a symbol of precision and strength. Each stitch was firmer, more deliberate. I was piecing together not just scraps of fabric, but the fragments of my new self. The woman who had been afraid of a leaky pipe was gone. The woman who sat there now understood that the greatest dangers are not the ones that make noise, but the ones that come disguised as a blessing. The police report led nowhere. Elijah had vanished, likely on his way to another small town, another trusting church, to find another vulnerable target. A part of me was angry that he would not face legal justice, but a larger part of me didn't care. The victory that mattered had already been won. It was won in the moment the bus door hissed shut. He was gone from our lives, a ghost exorcised by a mother's fury. Our peace was our justice. I took the porcelain angel from its place of honor on the mantelpiece. For years, it had represented a faith that was passive, a belief in a protection that came from outside myself. I didn't throw it away. Instead, I placed it on a side table, a simple decoration. In its place, I put my favorite photograph of me and John, taken on our 40th anniversary. He looked so proud, his arm wrapped around me. I realized my strength hadn't come from the sky. It came from the love I had lived, the life I had built, and the legacy of the man who always told me my spine was made of Georgia steel. My relationship with my faith changed. It was no longer about sitting in a pew and waiting for guidance. It became something active, a force that lived in my hands and my heart. Prayer was no longer just a whispered plea for help. It was the roar of a V8 engine on an open highway. It was the steady, determined march across a parking lot toward the source of my fear. It was the act of becoming the answer to my own prayers. I look at my hands now, the wrinkled skin and the prominent veins, and I see them for what they truly are. They are the hands that held my husband's as he passed. They are the hands that raised a daughter, stitched hundreds of quilts, and tended a garden that brought forth life from the red Georgia clay. And they are the hands that took back what was mine from the clutches of evil. They are not weak. They are the product of a life lived, a love, fiercely guarded. This experience taught me that we often mistake gentleness for fragility. We see a quiet woman, a loving mother, a faithful churchgoer, and we assume she is breakable. But the truth is, the deepest reservoirs of strength are often hidden in the quietest souls. It is a strength that lies dormant, waiting for the one thing that matters more than life itself to be threatened. For me, that was my daughter. I learned that true strength isn't about the absence of fear. I was terrified every single second of that drive. It's about what you do when you are terrified. It's about putting your foot on the accelerator even when your whole body is screaming at you to stop. It's about walking onto that bus when every instinct tells you to run away and wait for someone else, someone stronger, to handle it. And so, my final message is this: a truth I learned not in a church, but on the hot asphalt of Interstate 75. They say faith can move mountains, and I believe that. But I also learned that love is a different kind of force. Sometimes love doesn't have time to pray the mountain out of the way. Sometimes love gets in its old, dusty car, turns the key in the ignition, and drives straight through the heart of it. And that, I've come to understand, is its own kind of sacred prayer.